Before we begin, if you're enjoying this type of content, hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, check out my other channel where I'm developing even more mysterious stories like this one. Today, we're diving into one of the most unsettling mysteries in photography history. In 1902, a couple exchanged what they thought would be their last kiss before a long journey. The image captured that tender moment, a symbol of love and devotion. But when historians zoomed into this vintage photograph decades later, they discovered something that defied explanation, something that shouldn't have been there, something that has haunted researchers ever since. The question that lingers: did the tragedy they feared truly begin after the photo was taken? Or did it start at the exact moment the camera clicked? The autumn of 1902 was unusually cold in Boston, Massachusetts. The city's cobblestone streets glistened with early morning frost as merchants opened their shops and horse-drawn carriages clattered past Victorian brownstones. In one of these elegant homes on Beacon Hill lived James and Eleanor Whitmore, a couple whose love story had become the talk of their social circle. James, a merchant marine captain, stood in the parlor of their townhouse, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his formal coat. Eleanor descended the staircase in her traveling dress, a navy wool ensemble with white lace trim that accentuated her delicate features. At 32 years old, she possessed the kind of beauty that seemed frozen in time. Dark eyes that reflected both intelligence and melancholy, auburn hair pinned elegantly beneath a feathered hat. They had decided weeks earlier that James would embark on a dangerous expedition to the Arctic. The voyage would take him away for nearly 2 years. Eleanor had accepted this with the stoicism expected of a captain's wife, though her letters reveal the deep anxiety she harbored about his departure. On their final morning together, they made an unconventional decision. They would commission a photographer to capture their last moment of intimacy before separation. This was not common practice among the upper classes of Boston. Such emotional displays were typically reserved for private moments. But James and Eleanor were different. Their love, though proper in appearance, burned with an intensity that occasionally broke through the rigid social conventions of the era. The photographer, a meticulous man named Henry Carmichael, arrived at the Whitmore residence around noon. He carried with him a large wooden camera mounted on a tripod, glass plates for negatives, and an array of reflective surfaces to manage the natural light streaming through the parlor windows. The process of photography in 1902 was laborious and time-consuming, requiring subjects to remain absolutely still for several seconds while the lens captured the image. Eleanor and James positioned themselves near the window, where the light was most favorable. James stood slightly behind his wife, his arm encircling her waist. Eleanor tilted her face toward his, their lips nearly touching in what would become known as the farewell kiss, a pose that conveyed both tenderness and resignation to an uncertain future. "Hold perfectly still," Carmichael instructed, his voice muffled beneath the dark cloth draped over his camera. "The exposure will take approximately 5 seconds. Do not move, do not blink, do not breathe too heavily." James and Eleanor froze. The moment stretched out like an eternity. Outside, the sounds of Boston continued. The calls of street vendors, the clatter of wheels on stone, the distant cry of seagulls. Inside, there was only silence and the soft click of the camera's shutter. The photograph was developed 3 days later. Carmichael delivered the framed print personally, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. When Eleanor unwrapped it, she gasped. The image was exquisite. James and Eleanor suspended in time, their love rendered permanent in chemical emulsion and silver. She placed it on the mantelpiece, where it would remain until James's departure, a daily reminder of what he would be leaving behind. 2 weeks later, James boarded his ship. Eleanor watched from the dock, as the vessel pulled away from the harbor, growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared beyond the horizon. She never saw him again. The ship, the Arcturus, encountered severe ice storms in the Labrador Sea. It sank in November of that year, with all hands lost. Eleanor received the news in early December, delivered by a naval officer in dress uniform who stood uncomfortably in her parlor. She said nothing. She simply turned to face the photograph on the mantelpiece and stared at it for hours. Eleanor lived for another 43 years after James's death. She never remarried, never traveled, never sought companionship beyond her elderly sister. She spent her days tending to a small garden behind her townhouse and organizing charitable works for widows of lost sailors. The photograph remained on her mantelpiece throughout her life, a constant companion to her solitude. When Eleanor passed away in 1945, her estate was inherited by a distant cousin who had little interest in the personal effects of a woman he barely knew. The townhouse was sold, its contents dispersed among auction houses and antique dealers. The photograph of James and Eleanor's final kiss was packed into a wooden crate, along with other miscellaneous items, and stored in the attic of a neighboring property, where it would remain undisturbed for nearly 7 decades. It was a historian named Dr. Margaret Chen who would eventually discover the photograph in 2012. While researching the social history of Boston's merchant class during the early 20th century. She found it quite by accident, tucked into a leather-bound journal that documented the lives of several prominent families from the era. The image was still in its original frame, though the photograph itself had begun to fade, the silver nitrate base deteriorating with age. Dr. Chen was immediately struck by the tenderness captured in the image. She had never seen a photograph quite like it, so intimate, so deliberately posed to convey emotion rather than mere documentation. But as she studied the print more closely, something began to trouble her. There seemed to be something else in the photograph, something barely visible in the background, just over Eleanor's shoulder. She decided to have the image professionally scanned and digitally enhanced. Engagement pause. If you're enjoying this mystery so far, drop a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything, and it helps me bring more stories like this to your screen. What do you think happened to James? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Dr. Margaret Chen brought the original photograph to the Center for Advanced Digital Imaging at Boston University, where her colleague Professor David Rothstein specialized in the restoration and analysis of historical photographs. The center occupied the 3rd floor of a modern building on Commonwealth Avenue, its laboratories filled with sophisticated equipment designed to extract information from degraded and damaged images. Rothstein examined the print through a magnifying glass first, his experienced eye assessing its condition. The photograph was remarkably well preserved for its age, though the emulsion had begun to crystallize in places, creating small white spots across the surface. The frame itself was constructed from oak, and the glass protecting the image was original to the piece. "This is a beautiful specimen," Rothstein said, adjusting his glasses. "The technique is consistent with the work of Henry Carmichael, a prominent Boston photographer of the era. I recognize his signature style, the way he managed the natural light, the composition. This is definitely his work." "Can you enhance it?" Chen asked. "I want to know what's in the background. There's something there that I can't quite make out." Rothstein nodded and carefully removed the photograph from its frame. He scanned it using a high-resolution digital scanner, capturing the image at 4800 dpi. The resulting file was enormous, over 2 gigabytes, but it contained every detail of the original photograph, magnified and made accessible through computer software. Working in the laboratory's climate-controlled environment, Rothstein uploaded the scan into a specialized program designed for photograph enhancement. The software used algorithms to reduce noise, correct color distortion, and sharpen details that had become obscured by time and decay. He began adjusting the levels and contrast, carefully manipulating the image to reveal hidden information without introducing artifacts or false data. As the enhancement process progressed, something began to emerge from the background. At first, it was barely perceptible, just a slight variation in tone and texture behind Eleanor's shoulder. Rothstein adjusted the parameters further, increasing the clarity while maintaining the integrity of the original image. "Margaret, come look at this," he called out. Chen moved closer to the screen. Her breath caught. Behind Eleanor's shoulder, rendered in a ghostly translucence, was a human figure. It appeared to be a woman, her features indistinct, but her presence undeniable. The figure was partially obscured, as if standing behind Eleanor, or perhaps slightly out of focus. But the most disturbing aspect was her expression. Even through the haze and the degradation of the film, it was possible to discern what appeared to be profound sadness or anguish in her face. "Is this an artifact?" Chen whispered. "A defect in the film?" Rothstein was already performing additional analyses. He zoomed in on the figure, enhanced it further, and ran it through several quality assurance protocols. The figure remained consistent across multiple iterations of the enhancement. "No," Rothstein said slowly, "this isn't a scanning error or a digital artifact. This figure is actually present in the original photograph. It was captured on the film itself during the initial exposure." Chen felt a chill run through her body. She began asking the obvious questions, the logical explanations that should have presented themselves immediately. Could it be a double exposure? A mistake by the photographer? A second person in the room who had inadvertently been captured? Rothstein had already considered these possibilities. He accessed the historical records related to Henry Carmichael and his photographic techniques. Carmichael was known for his meticulous professionalism and his precision with his equipment. Double exposures would have been an unforgivable mistake for a photographer of his caliber, especially in a commissioned portrait like this one. Moreover, Carmichael's journals, preserved at the Boston Public Library, documented his process for each photograph he took. The entry for the Whitmore portrait was detailed and specific. 1 exposure, 5 seconds, optimal light conditions, no technical difficulties. And there was another problem. The figure in the background was not in sharp focus, but it wasn't out of focus either. It existed in a strange middle ground, rendered with less clarity than Eleanor and James, but with more definition than something that had wandered accidentally through the frame. This suggested that the figure had been present, but somehow not directly perceived by the photographer or the subjects at the moment the photograph was taken. Rothstein performed one final analysis. He examined the grain structure of the film, the pattern of light and shadow that would indicate whether this figure was truly part of the original exposure, or whether it had been added later through some form of photo manipulation. The technology didn't exist in 1902 for the kind of sophisticated image alteration that would have been required to create such a seamless insertion, and Carmichael's reputation was impeccable. There was no evidence he had ever engaged in such practices. "I don't know what we're looking at," Rothstein admitted, "but I can tell you with absolute certainty that this figure is present in the original photograph. She was there when the image was captured." During engagement pause. If this content is resonating with you, hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated on more mysterious stories. Leave a comment below. What do you think that figure in the photograph represents? Is this a genuine mystery, or is there a logical explanation we're missing? News of the discovery spread quickly through academic circles. Within weeks, Dr. Chen found herself contacted by historians, photograph experts, and paranormal researchers alike. Everyone wanted to study the Whitmore photograph. Everyone had theories. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a historian specializing in early 20th century Boston, became Chen's collaborator on the project. Mitchell had access to extensive archives documenting the lives of prominent Boston families, and she began researching James and Eleanor Whitmore in detail. hoping to find some explanation for the mysterious figure in their photograph. What Mitchell discovered was both illuminating and troubling. Eleanor Whitmore had indeed married James in 1895, following a courtship that their families considered appropriate and advantageous. But the marriage records, combined with letters preserved in private collections, revealed something darker beneath the surface of their domestic arrangement. Eleanor had been engaged previously to a man named William Ashford, a promising young physician. The engagement had lasted 3 years, and by all accounts, Eleanor had been devoted to William. But in 1893, William had died under mysterious circumstances. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but Eleanor's private correspondence suggested something more complicated. She wrote of William's despair, his increasing detachment from life, his references to the futility of existence. In one particularly poignant letter to her sister, Eleanor mentioned that William had spoken of a persistent shadow that follows me, a presence that I cannot escape. 2 years after William's death, Eleanor had accepted James Whitmore's proposal. The marriage appeared to be a successful union, but Mitchell discovered something that would prove crucial to understanding the photograph. Eleanor had never truly moved beyond her grief for William. Her journals, written in the privacy of her bedroom and never intended for public view, revealed that she experienced frequent episodes of profound melancholy. She wrote of seeing shadows in the corners of rooms, of hearing voices that called her name, of an overwhelming sense of being watched by something unseen. In one entry dated just 2 weeks before the photograph was taken, Eleanor had written, "I sometimes wonder if William still lingers in this world, if he remains present, unseen, watching over me. At times I feel his presence so acutely that I can almost touch him. James does not understand. He thinks me fanciful and prone to hysteria, as the doctors have suggested, but I know what I feel. I know what I sense." Mitchell brought these findings to Chen. The implications were unsettling. The figure in the photograph, barely visible and rendered in that strange, translucent quality, had been captured at the exact moment Eleanor was experiencing one of her episodes of profound emotional distress. Whether this figure was William Ashford, whether it was a manifestation of Eleanor's psychological state, or whether it was something else entirely remained unanswered. Other researchers proposed alternative explanations. A photographer from New York suggested that the figure might be a reflection, perhaps of someone standing outside the window, or of a mirror positioned in the room. But Rothstein had already investigated this possibility. The position of the figure didn't correspond to any logical reflection. The angle was wrong. The perspective didn't align with the geometry of the room, as documented in historical floor plans. A paranormal investigator named Thomas Bradley suggested that the figure was a genuine ghost, the spirit of William Ashford, somehow present in the room at the moment James and Eleanor exchanged their final kiss. Bradley pointed to the expression on the figure's face, which he interpreted as anguish or sorrow. He speculated that William's spirit had been drawn to Eleanor during her moment of vulnerability, perhaps attempting to communicate or to express his continued attachment to her. But Bradley's explanation, while emotionally compelling, lacked scientific rigor. There was no evidence that William Ashford had died with any unfinished business or unresolved trauma that would cause his spirit to linger. Moreover, the very concept of ghosts existed outside the realm of measurable, reproducible phenomena that could be scientifically verified. Chen found herself increasingly frustrated by the lack of concrete answers. She spent countless hours studying the photograph, reading Eleanor's journals, researching the historical context of 1902. The more she learned about Eleanor and James and their tragic circumstances, the more the photograph seemed to resist simple explanation. One evening, while reviewing Eleanor's correspondence for what must have been the 100th time, Chen noticed something she had previously overlooked. In a letter written to her sister just after the photograph was taken, Eleanor had made a cryptic reference. The photographer captured more than I could have anticipated. When he showed me the developed print, I felt as though something essential had been exposed, not in the image itself, but in what the image revealed about my own heart. I saw in that photograph a truth that I had been unable to confront while awake, and now I cannot unsee it. What had Eleanor seen in the photograph? Had she noticed the figure in the background? Had she recognized it as William? Or had Eleanor been referring to something else entirely, perhaps her own state of mind rendered visible through the mysterious presence of the translucent woman? Chen decided to commission a series of psychological profiles based on Eleanor's writings. A clinical psychologist named Dr. James Fletcher analyzed Eleanor's journals and letters, offering his professional assessment of her mental and emotional state during the period leading up to the photograph. Fletcher's conclusion was that Eleanor had likely been experiencing what might, in modern terminology, be described as depression with dissociative episodes. Her references to shadows and presences, her sense of being watched, and her inability to fully process her grief for William were all consistent with a psychological condition that manifested in unusual perceptual experiences. Whether these experiences were hallucinations, intuitions, or something else remained ambiguous. But Fletcher made one observation that stayed with Chen. What Ms. Whitmore describes sounds less like typical depression and more like a persistent sense of not being alone. She speaks repeatedly of a presence, of being observed, of shadows that follow her. This could indicate a dissociative state in which she externalized her own inner conflict, projecting her grief and anxiety onto an imaginary other. But it's also consistent with a person who genuinely senses something that others around her cannot perceive. As the investigation progressed, Chen became increasingly aware that the photograph was resisting definitive interpretation. The more evidence she gathered, the more questions emerged. The more explanations she considered, the less satisfying any single explanation became. The Whitmore photograph seemed to exist in a space between the rational and the inexplicable, offering tantalizing clues but no conclusive answers. Engagement pause. If you're enjoying this deep dive into mystery and history, please like this video and subscribe for more content like this. What's your theory? Is Eleanor's experience psychological, supernatural, or something we don't yet have words for? Share your thoughts in the comments. James Whitmore's voyage to the Arctic was meticulously documented. The ship's logs, preserved in the archives of the Boston Maritime Museum, chronicle the Arcturus's journey with clinical precision. The captain, a seasoned mariner named Robert Cunningham, recorded weather conditions, the position of the ship, encounters with other vessels, and the health and conduct of the crew. The logs reveal nothing unusual about the early stages of the voyage. The ship departed Boston Harbor on November 2, 1902, with a crew of 43 men and sufficient provisions for a 2-year expedition. The stated objective was to establish a permanent research station in the Canadian Arctic and to conduct surveys of previously unmapped territories. James Whitmore's role was to assist with the logistical coordination of the expedition and to oversee the transportation of equipment and supplies. For the first 2 weeks at sea, conditions were favorable. The logs describe moderate winds, calm seas, and steady progress northward. But on November 16th, the weather began to change. Captain Cunningham noted increasing cloud cover and a shift in wind patterns. By November 18th, the first storm appeared on the horizon. What followed was a series of increasingly severe weather events. The logs describe waves of extraordinary height, winds that exceeded the capability of the ship's instruments to measure, and visibility so reduced that the crew could barely see the bow of the ship from the stern. The Arcturus was pushed northward faster than intended, into regions where the Arctic ice was beginning to form. On November 21st, Captain Cunningham made a notation that would later be analyzed extensively by maritime historians. The ship seems to possess a will of its own. No matter how I adjust the sails or the rudder, we are drawn inexorably toward the ice. The men speak of a curse, of a shadow that moves alongside us in the storm. I dismiss such superstition, and yet I cannot entirely ignore the fear in their eyes. That same night, James Whitmore wrote a letter to Eleanor. It was the last letter he would ever write. The letter was never sent. It was found among his personal effects when the Arcturus eventually sank, but it survives in the archives of the Boston Public Library. In the letter, James expressed his love for Eleanor and his deep regret about their separation. But there were also passages that suggested something more troubling. I find myself haunted by thoughts of you and of our final photograph together. When I look at it, and I have looked at it often during these past weeks, I feel as though something is missing from the image, some essential truth that the camera failed to capture or captured in a way I do not yet understand. I have begun to wonder if the photograph was an omen, a warning of some kind. I know this is foolish and unscientific, but there is a peculiar quality to the image that disturbs me more with each passing day. It is as if the photograph is trying to communicate something that the photographer did not intend. James went on to describe his conviction that the voyage was somehow connected to Eleanor's emotional state. He theorized that his departure had triggered something in her, a kind of psychic disturbance that was now reaching out to him across the vast distance of the Atlantic Ocean. He wrote, "I feel her presence here with me, Eleanor. I feel her sorrow as though it were my own, and I confess that I am afraid, not of the storm, not of the ice, but of what this presence might mean. What if my fear for her safety has somehow drawn her spirit into this realm? And what if that presence is now drawing us both toward oblivion?" These words, written in James's careful hand on the night of November 21st, would later be interpreted by different researchers in radically different ways. Some saw them as evidence of James's psychological deterioration, brought on by stress and isolation. Others saw them as confirmation of something more profound, a connection between Eleanor and James that transcended the physical distance separating them, a kind of entanglement that manifested in the photograph and persisted even after James left Boston. On the morning of November 22nd, Captain Cunningham attempted to change course, trying to steer the Arcturus away from the advancing ice floes, but the ship refused to respond. The logs described the rudder as becoming impossibly difficult to move, as if some tremendous force was holding it in place. Cunningham ordered the crew to attempt manual repairs, but the men reported that the rudder appeared to be functioning normally. It was something else that prevented the ship from turning. That evening, James Whitmore was on deck, helping to secure the rigging against the wind. According to the testimony of a crew member named Henry Marsh, who survived long enough to relay the events to a rescue ship before succumbing to hypothermia, James suddenly stopped working and stared out toward the horizon. Marsh reported that James seemed to be looking at something in the mist and snow, something that no one else could see. He pointed out toward the ice, Marsh later testified, and he said, "She's there. I can see her now." I asked him what he meant, who he could see, but he wouldn't answer. He just kept staring out into the storm, and then he said something that chilled me more than the Arctic wind ever could. He said, "She's calling me home. I understand now. She needed me to come back to her, and I'm going home." Minutes later, the Arcturus struck an ice floe with tremendous force. The collision ruptured the hull below the waterline. Water poured into the ship's compartments faster than the crew could manage. Within 30 minutes, the Arcturus was taking on water irretrievably. Captain Cunningham ordered the crew to abandon ship. James Whitmore was never seen after the collision. Some witnesses reported seeing him standing alone on the deck as the ship began to sink, making no effort to move toward the lifeboats. Others reported that they heard him calling out a name, Eleanor's name, as the waves pulled him down. Of the 43 men aboard the Arcturus, only 4 survived. They were picked up by a whaling vessel 3 days later, half frozen and in a state of severe shock. Their accounts of the sinking were remarkably consistent regarding one detail. James Whitmore had seemed almost peaceful in his final moments, as if he were welcoming the sea rather than resisting it. Engagement pause. If this story is captivating you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support drives me to bring more mysterious narratives to life. I want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment telling me what you think connected Eleanor and James in that final moment. In the years following Dr. Chen's discovery of the mysterious figure in the Whitmore photograph, numerous theories have been proposed, studied, and debated. Yet despite all the research, all the analysis, and all the expert opinions, the photograph remains fundamentally inexplicable. Some researchers have settled on psychological explanations. They point to Eleanor's documented struggles with depression and dissociation, and they suggest that the figure in the photograph is a manifestation of her internal turmoil, rendered visible through some unknown mechanism. Perhaps a trick of light, perhaps a genuine hallucination that somehow impressed itself onto the photographic plate through pure psychological force. In this interpretation, the photograph becomes a record not of objective reality, but of Eleanor's subjective experience, a visualization of her inner landscape of grief and loss. Others have proposed that the photograph might be evidence of something that science does not yet have adequate vocabulary to describe. They point out that phenomena like quantum entanglement, though existing in the realm of particle physics, demonstrate that connection and influence can occur across distances in ways that seem to defy classical physics. Could there be, they suggest, an analogous phenomenon operating at the level of human consciousness? Could two people who are deeply emotionally bonded possess some form of connection that allows them to influence or perceive each other's psychological states, even across vast distances? A few researchers, notably paranormal investigator Thomas Bradley, have argued for a more straightforward supernatural interpretation. They believe that the figure in the photograph is indeed the ghost of William Ashford, Eleanor's deceased fiancé, and that his presence in the photograph is evidence that spirits of the dead can interact with the living under specific circumstances, particularly when the living person is experiencing intense emotional distress, or when there exists a powerful emotional bond between the living and the deceased. But Bradley's interpretation, while emotionally compelling, raises more questions than it answers. If William Ashford's spirit was present in the photograph, why? What purpose did his presence serve? And if spirits can manifest in this way, why is such evidence so extraordinarily rare? Thousands of photographs have been taken since 1902, millions in the decades since. If ghosts could appear in photographs, wouldn't there be far more documented cases? Then there is Eleanor herself, the key figure in this mystery. She lived another 43 years after James's death, never remarrying, never fully recovering from her losses. The journals she kept during this period reveal a woman of profound sensitivity and perceptiveness, but also a woman struggling with overwhelming sadness and a sense of isolation that even her charitable works could not fully alleviate. In her final journal entry, written just weeks before her death in 1945, Eleanor wrote something that seems to address the mystery directly. "I have spent a lifetime trying to understand what I saw, what I felt, what the photograph captured that was beyond the capacity of words to describe. I have consulted with doctors and spiritualists, with philosophers and priests. Each has offered explanations, but none have satisfied the truth that lives in my heart. I believe now that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some truths are too large, too strange, too profound to be compressed into the neat categories that our rational minds prefer. What I know is this: I loved William. and he loved me. I loved James, and he loved me. And in the moment captured by the camera in 1902, all of these threads of love and loss and longing somehow converged in a way that the photographic plate could not fully render, but could not entirely ignore. The figure in the photograph is real. Whether she is a ghost, a manifestation of grief, a trick of light, or something that exists beyond our current understanding of reality, I cannot say. But I know she was there. And I know that she was calling out across the boundaries between life and death, between the seen and the unseen, with a message that I have never quite been able to fully understand. Lou, today, the Whitmore photograph remains one of the most studied and debated images in the history of photography. It has been subjected to countless enhancements, analyses, and interpretations. Multiple researchers have attempted to replicate the conditions under which the photograph was taken, hoping to discover some logical explanation for the mysterious figure. To date, none have succeeded in definitively proving how the figure came to appear in the image. The photograph now resides in the archives of the Boston Public Library, preserved under climate-controlled conditions and displayed behind protective glass. Thousands of visitors view it each year. Some come seeking scientific explanation. Others come seeking mystery, hoping that the photograph might offer them insight into questions that science has failed to answer. Still others come seeking something more personal, a connection to the human experiences of love, loss, and the eternal question of whether there exists something beyond the material world that we can measure and understand. The mystery of the Whitmore photograph ultimately tells us something profound about the nature of human experience itself. It reminds us that there are aspects of reality that resist simple categorization, that exist in the ambiguous spaces between the rational and the irrational, between the material and the immaterial. Whether the figure in the photograph is explained through psychology, physics, spirituality, or some combination of these frameworks may matter less than the fact that she is there at all, a presence that demands to be acknowledged, a mystery that invites us to expand our understanding of what is possible. Eleanor Whitmore spent her entire life asking the question that the photograph poses: what is the nature of love and connection? Can bonds between people persist across death? Do we haunt each other, even in life? Can our deepest emotions reach out and touch the world in ways that seem impossible, that seem to belong to the realm of the supernatural? The photograph of 1902 does not answer these questions, but it poses them with a haunting clarity that no words could ever achieve. And perhaps that is the real mystery. Not what the photograph shows, but what the photograph asks. In the space between Eleanor and James, in the translucent presence of that unnamed figure, we encounter the eternal human questions that have driven art, religion, philosophy, and science since the beginning of consciousness itself. The mystery remains unsolved, and perhaps it is meant to. If you enjoyed this deep exploration into the mystery surrounding the Whitmore photograph, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment down below. What do you believe that figure represents? Is it a logical explanation or something beyond our current understanding? If you found this content engaging and mysterious, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Your support means everything to me and helps me continue creating content that explores the mysteries that connect history, psychology, emotion, and the unknown. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the photograph of 1902. Until next time, keep questioning, keep wondering, and keep looking for the mysteries that hide in plain sight.